What's up YouTube? Welcome back to the channel for Webflow Pros. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to make this interactive carousel slider in Webflow. I'll show how to fully customize the slider and make it responsive to fit your design. So let's dive right in. Alright, for this tutorial we'll be using Splide.js. It's very lightweight, easy to customize, and it works with multiple sliders per page, works with the Webflow CMS and responsive units. I've tried quite a few sliders out and this has been my favorite so far. I'll leave the code for this tutorial in the description of the video. Copy this first block, which is all the CSS, go to the page the slider will be on, and in the head tag section paste all the styles. And then for the second block, this is the JavaScript. We need to copy that, and on the same page in the closing body tag section, this is where we'll paste all the JavaScript. I'll be building this out with a collection list, but you're welcome to use divs in place of the wrapper, list, and item if you'd like to avoid using a CMS. Either way, we need to drag a div onto the page, and I'm going to drag this div directly inside a container, and I'm going to give it the class of Splide. And then inside of that, this is where I'll drag in my collection list, and I'll pull it from the collection that I have. So the wrapper gets a class of Splide __ track, and then inside of that, the list gets a class of Splide __ list, and finally the item needs a class of Splide __ slide. The Splide div, I'll go ahead and give a width of 100% and a position of relative. The collection wrapper or the track, I'll go ahead and give a width of 100%, and then in the collection list, I'm going to apply flexbox, align to stretch, justify left, and then I need to give the items a set width. So in this case, I'm thinking I'll have about 3 items inside the container at any time. So I'll do 100 divided by 3%. That should give me my 3 items. They're in a flexbox, so they're being squished, but I can set the sizing to don't shrink or grow to maintain the exactly 1/3 width that I want here. Now I am getting horizontal scroll, so all my sections are in this div called overflow. I can give a width of 100%, overflow hidden, and position a relative to disable that horizontal scrolling. I'll also paste my card design inside my collection item. Now the way that I've created this separation between cards before is just to add padding inside the collection item. We can't use margin, but we can use padding. And then if it was a centered align slider, I would add added padding to both sides. Only issue with this method is any full width content in the containers directly above or below. We'll realize that these slides aren't actually aligned with the edge of the entire container anymore. They're not spanning the full width. So Splide actually has a better option for that. Then the overall Splide div, we need to give a combo class because we may have multiple of these sliders. Each of them may have different settings. So we need to tell the code which slide to apply these settings to. So I'll just give it a class of slider1. Now in our code, you'll notice we're targeting this slider1. We can have multiple of these slider1s on the page, but they're all going to share the same settings. If we need it to have different settings, we'll have to duplicate it and make a slider too. So this per page move is what determines the width of our collection items. Since this is set to 5 items per page, the width of all our collection items would be 20% each to fit those 5 items inside the container. So the width we set in Webflow doesn't actually define what we see on the live site. So we're going to switch this to 3, so we just see 3 items inside the container. And then we have this gap property. That's what we can use to create the space in between our slides. And the advantage to using this over padding is the items will go all the way to the edge of the container while still maintaining a nice gap in between each of the slides. I'll leave this set to 2em for now. Now on the live site, we have this nice gap between the items, but they're still allowed to span the full width of the container. We can drag out like this. We have these basic Splide arrows, but we're going to want to customize them and build our own. I'll create a copy of the arrows and pagination in the style guide section. That way I can customize it at any point I want. So I'll start by dragging a div and giving it the class of Splide. This won't be a functioning slider, it's just to have a style guide copy I can change later. And then inside that div, I'm going to drag another div. And I need to give this one a class of Splide __ arrows. And then inside of that, we can have the actual arrow elements. So these will just be Webflow button elements, and it's going to have the class of Splide __ arrow. And then I'm going to go ahead and delete the text inside of it. And then we also need to give it a background image. So we have that arrow image applied. So just add that background image here. I'll set the width to something like 30% and set position center and no tile. And then I'll just go ahead and duplicate the arrow. Now each of these get combo classes. So this one gets a combo class of Splide __ arrow -- prev. And then I'm going to just use a transform of rotate to flip it over. And then this one gets the combo class of Splide __ arrow -- next. Now we can actually just copy this entire arrows div, and let me go ahead and put flexbox on it just to make sure they stay stacked side by side. So I'll copy that div and we can paste it anywhere inside the main Splide div if we want to apply our own custom arrows. So they can be on top, above the collection list, they can be underneath it, wherever we want them to be. Now on the live site it's working, we can press and it's navigating to the next slide, but when we reach the last one and we click, it jumps us back up to the top of the page. That's because button elements in Webflow are actually just link blocks. I feel like I've been lied to this whole time. Splide requires these to be actual button elements. So instead of using the Webflow button, let's drag an embed in and create a real button using code. So we'll just do a button like this and then close it off like that. And then we want to give this a class that matches the classes we used in Webflow. So in this case, it's Splide __ arrow. And then we'll do a space to create our combo class. And it has the combo class of Splide __ arrow -- brief. And then we can save this. And let's just duplicate this embed. And then this one here will have the combo class of -- next. And we can save. I'll delete the original ones. And the great thing about this is any changes we make to the original Webflow elements down here will also change the style of the ones in the embed. Now let's create the style for our pagination dots. We'll go ahead and add a list element onto the page, and we need to make sure it's inside of the Splide. And then this one needs a class of Splide __ pagination. Now the items inside of that, we'll go ahead and give a class of Splide __ pagination __ item, and we'll use that to set them to inline block, so that way they'll stack side by side. Inside that item, this is where we can actually drag a div, and this is the actual pagination dot that we see. So it needs a class of Splide __ pagination __ page. And this can have a width, height, we can style it however we want, a background color, and then I'll just go ahead and duplicate the item while we're at it. And let's go ahead and zero out the padding that comes with the list right here. We'll go ahead and give this a little bit of left margin of 0.3 EMs, and I'll even turn the opacity down to something like 20%. Now the one that's active is going to get a combo class of is-active. So once we have that class applied, we can change that, maybe change its color, its opacity, whatever we want to change there. So I also want this to kind of be on side of the arrows. Since its parent, which is the overall Splide, has a position of relative, what I could do is basically give this entire list a position of absolute to the bottom corner of the parent, and now it'll be fixed right there. The pagination list works a little bit differently than the arrows in that we don't have to manually paste it inside of each slider on our page. It's going to be added to it after page load, but we'll use this copy here so that way we can style all of them across the different breakpoints. Now on the live site, we have our functioning arrows and functioning pagination. Whenever we reach the beginning or the end of the slide, we want to disable one of the arrows so that way we know we can't go any further. To do this, we'll open up an embed on our page. Inside the style tags, we're going to target a class of Splide, and then we'll do space in the word button, and then we'll do a colon in the word disabled. And then we can open up our brackets and we can set this maybe to an opacity of 0.4, and then that'll do it. So we're targeting every Splide because chances are we'll want this disabled button to look the same on every single one of our sliders. Then we're finding every button inside of each of those sliders only when it's disabled, and we're lowering the opacity of that button. Since these button elements have a nice CSS transition applied, it should fade to that lower opacity. And sure enough, that works. I went ahead and duplicated this section and replaced the content inside the slide item with a different design. What we can do is go ahead and select the overall section, give it a combo class of isDark that sort of changes the font color and the background color to invert it. Now we do want the pagination color and the arrow colors to change out whenever we're in this section, and they're not actually in here for us to be able to give them unique combo classes, so we can target them with CSS whenever they're inside of a section with that isDark class. We'll open up our embed, we'll target the isDark class, we're going to create a space, and we're going to look for an element inside it with the class of Splide __ arrow, and then we'll open up our brackets. And what do we want to do with the arrow? Well, we could change its border color, maybe change its background image, take it piece by piece. But in this case, I think the easiest thing for me to do is just to invert the color. So I'll do a filter, I'll do invert of 100%, and then end it like that. And now whenever it's inside the dark section, you'll notice it's inverted to white. We'll also want to change the pagination. So right now, all the pagination dots have that same background color, this dark background color, and we're just turning up the opacity on the active one. So what I could do is whenever it's inside a dark section, I could set it to be this light color instead. So I'll just copy the hex code of that light color and then open up the main embed again. And then what we'll say is we'll target this same is dark section, and then we're gonna look for a Splide __ pagination __ page, which is the class of those dots. And all we're going to do is set their background color to the hex code that we just copied and save. On the top section, we actually want the pagination dots to disappear altogether and leave them only in the bottom section. We're also going to want this section to be a little bit offset to where we're seeing a little bit more of that third slide peeking in, about half of it here, instead of this full one here. So Splide's figuring out how wide each item needs to be to exactly fill up this container. And we can't say show 3.5 items to where a little bit of this one's peeking in, and we can't decrease the width of the actual item here because the width of it's being set by the Splide code, not by our Webflow width here. So one solution we can do to fix that is with the main Splide div selected, we can add a bit of padding, and I don't want to add it to the main class because I don't want it to add to the one beneath. So I'll just create a new one and I'll call this pill, and it's for the pill shaped ones. And I'll set some padding right here of 14 EM, and it just pushes it over a little bit. So now the available space inside this main Splide container has been reduced. So that way when we see these 3 items, they're filling up the width of the available space, but we're seeing a bit more of this next card peek in because we added that padding here. And this one remains intact where it's taking up the full width. Since we want to hide the pagination dots only when they're inside this first slide, I can copy the class of this first slide here and open up my embed inside my CSS. And then under our pill slider, we'll go ahead and put the, we'll look for a class of Splide with the combo class of pill. And then we're going to look for an element inside it with the class of Splide pagination. And we'll just set the pagination to display none to hide it only when it's inside of our pill slider here. Now on the live site, this one has no pagination. It's a little bit offset. And then this one is still full width. It has the pagination and the colors are inverted. But both of these are still relying on that slider 1 combo class, so they both share the same Splide settings. Let's also create our active slide animation. So on this first one, whichever slide is active, we just want it to scale up inside its containers. So I have this image here, and then its container is set to overflow hidden and has the pill shape. So the image, I'm actually going to want to apply transforms, and it's going to start with a scale of 1, but whenever it becomes focused, we'll scale it up to maybe something like 1.1. And instead of just snapping to that scale, we'd like to add a transition, and I'll apply it to transform. If we get more specific and only use the ones we're actually going to need, it'll perform a lot better. So I'll apply maybe 350 milliseconds to this. I just want it to be less than the duration we actually have in the settings of how long the slide transition takes. So right now it takes about 600 milliseconds. So I just want this to be a little bit less than that time there. So whenever the slide is active, that's when I want it to scale up. So I can copy the class of this photo that I want to scale, and I can head over to my embed. First thing I want to do is target the active slide. So I'm going to get all the slides by doing Splide __ slide, and then I only want to get the active one. So the Splide gives the active slide a combo class of is-active, and then inside of that active slide, I want to find the image with this class. And then once we have that, we can apply a transform of scale, and we can scale it up to 1.1. So now that image is scaling up inside its container when it's become focused at a nice smooth duration. Now for this one here, we actually want the actual container to scale up, but the photo inside the container to scale down, and the text to become higher opacity. So we'll start by taking this photo and scaling it up initially to 1.2, so it's a lot higher. And then it'll have that transform of 350 milliseconds. We'll also add a transition to this one, and it's going to be applied to transform as well. And again, it would be 350 milliseconds. And it's going to start scaled at 1, so it's just not going to scale. And then we'll scale it back up whenever it becomes focused. We'll also take this div right here and maybe give it a class of text opacity. And we can set this to lower opacity, maybe like 30%, and add a transition applied to opacity of 350 as well. So that way when we increase the opacity, it fades up to that higher opacity. And we only want to do all this whenever our slide is active. So we'll start by grabbing this photo. We want to scale down. We'll open up our CSS. And underneath our square slider, this time we're going to, again, target the slide with the combo class of isActive. And then we're targeting a class inside there, which is the photo. And what we want to do with that is basically grab its transform. And it's scaled to 1.2 right now. We'll just scale it down to 1. So then we're also going to want the class of this actual image element. And this is the thing we're going to want to scale up. I'll paste that class there. We'll copy the code we wrote above. And this time, inside of the active slide, we want to find the overall container of the image. And we're going to scale it up to 1.05. So it'll be really subtle. We're also going to want to highlight the text. So we'll get the active slide again. And this time the element we want to find inside is the one with the class of text opacity that we created. And this time what we want to do is just take the opacity of that div and turn it all the way up. Now when a slide becomes active, the text gets highlighted, the actual container scales up, and the image inside scales down. I want it to be anchored though to the top instead of scaling from the center. So with the actual container selected, I'll apply a transform and set the transform setting to scale from the top. Now the alignment of these just feels a bit nicer. Let's go ahead and work on making this slider responsive. Before I was using the wizardry technique on desktop, so everything was just kind of scaling up and down with a unit. On tablet though, everything's kind of just switched to pixels, so we kind of have a bit of wrapping and like things are expanding in different sizes. So the first thing I would want to do is grab the entire slide item right here and set its width to be 50%, so that way we have just 2 slides in view, and that'll give us a little bit more space for all our items. You'll notice though that the height of these items isn't scaling in anymore. It's not being consistent because this height is essentially, even though it's set to EMs, it's pretty much pixels now. So the height isn't changing while the width actually is. So one thing that we can do to fix this is actually on desktop, what we can do, instead of defining a height on this image container, we can remove the height and set top padding using %. So maybe like something like 124%. Now it's accounting for the height of this padding plus the height of the image inside. We don't want to account for the height of the image inside, so we'll switch it to position absolute to cover its entire parent. And that way this padding is now what's defining the height of the items. We'll do the same for this image right here, position absolute to cover the height of its parent. Instead of setting a height on its parent, we'll just give it a top padding of 66%. Now on tablet, when we scale in and out, you'll notice that the height of the images are also scaling in and out, and they're maintaining the correct aspect ratio. I went ahead and set the container side paddings to viewport width. That way that space kind of scales, because especially since we're having some cards hanging over the edge, we want to make sure we're always leaving enough space that way we can see a little bit of it peeking in over the edge. One thing that I can do though is we have on the main slide of this one right here, we have this bit of padding right here. Right now, since it's set using EMs, it's essentially pixels, but I want this padding to scale as well. So I'll go ahead and set this to 6 viewport width, and that'll reduce it a little bit, but still give this a little bit of offset to where we have this item peeking in a bit. And that's looking good there. Once we get down to the next breakpoint, this is probably really where I would just make each one of these slides 100% width. So we'll grab the items, give it a width of 100%, and then we probably won't need to see that much of the next item peeking in since it's full width at this point. So I'll probably just reduce the padding to 0 here, and we'll just get a little bit of it peeking in over the edge there. And it'll stay 100% on the next breakpoint down as well. Now changing the width of those items in Webflow doesn't actually change it in our Splide settings. So we got to go over to our Splide settings, and luckily both of these sliders are using the same settings here. So this per page move tells it how many items to show at a time, and on desktop it's showing 3. But these breakpoints that I have in the code exactly match our Webflow breakpoints. So on tablet, if we want to show 2, we can just copy that and paste that setting there. And on mobile landscape, we'll only show 1, and mobile landscape here will show 1 as well. Now the gap between the items was set using EMs, which on desktop is equivalent to viewport width, but on tablet would be equivalent to pixels. And we really want the gap here to be viewport width on tablet and below. That way the gap scales down with the width of the browser. So I'll change the value here on the gap to 3 viewport width and put that same gap on each breakpoint. Now on the live site, what we'll notice is that our slider is completely responsive. On desktop, we're showing 3 items. When we get to tablet view, it's going to snap down to 2 items. Both of them still work. This one's still a little bit offset, so it's a little bit less width than the one underneath. And when we come down to mobile view and we get 1 item, even when we scale all the way down, we're still seeing a little bit of an item peeking in on either side. Our pagination though is sort of overlapping our links, so we can fix that in Webflow. Before, our pagination was position absolute, and that was fine for desktop, but once we get to tablet, we don't know how many of these dots we're going to have, and I don't want it to ever overlap those links. So I'd probably switch it to position relative, so that way it just stacks, and I'd probably remove the padding from, or the margin from this side, and add it to the other side, since we're going to have an alignment like so. And that's probably going to work pretty well for those pagination dots. Also on this breakpoint, just for this one slide, or honestly maybe for this breakpoint, I would probably want to center it up. It's fine here, but because the text is left aligned, because the text is center aligned on this one, I think I'll switch it to center aligned here. So I can just create another combo class and call it isMobileCenter, and then I'll use that to switch the flex direction. Since this has a margin of 1 EM on one side, I'll just add padding to the overall container of 1 EM to basically get this to be perfectly centered, and that's looking good there. Next, let me quickly walk you through a few of the options that Splide has. If you go to the Documents tab on their site and click on Options, here you can find a full list of options with descriptions on what each one does. To apply an option, we'll type the option name, and then we'll type its value. Most values need to be surrounded by single or double quotes, unless it's just a number with no pixel, viewport width, or any sort of unit behind it, or unless it's true or false. Those are the only 2 types that wouldn't get quotes around it. This trim space option, for instance, by default is set to false. That means when we reach the end of this slide, this very last slide is all the way on the edge. If we set this trim space option to true instead, then when we navigate towards the end, this last slide right here is all the way at the end. Rewind is another one that's set to false. If we change this to true, then on the live site, when we reach the end of our entire list and click, it cycles back to the first one. We can change the speed at which the slider moves and the speed at which it rewinds. Wait for transition is set to false. If we change that to true, then we can't click to advance to the next slide till our transition is completely finished. Drag threshold by default is set to 30. This is how far do you need to drag before the next slide is pushed over. If we increase this to something really high, like 350, we'll feel a lot more resistance before it's actually pushed over. The type of the slide by default is set to slide. This means it has a clear defined start and end point. If we change this to loop and save, now our sliders will be infinite with no ever stop or end point. By default, the slide all the way at the beginning is the focused one, but if we want the middle one to be focused, all we have to do is change focus from 0, wrap it in quotes, and put the word center. Then our middle slide becomes focused. If we want to crop off these 2 ends right here and only see these 3 slides in the middle, all we have to do is grab our Splide container. I'll go ahead and give this a combo class and set the overflow to hidden. Now those excess slides are being cropped off on this example, but this example still allows to bleed full width. Both of our sliders so far are using the exact same settings. So if one's loop, then they're all loop. If one has 5 slides, then they all have 5 slides. If we want to have different settings for different sliders, what we'd have to do is copy all of this code right here, make a duplicate of it down here, paste it, and then we'd need to renumber it. So for instance, this would need to change to slider 2, this would need to change to slider 2, And then also this class name would need to change to slider2. Then on our Splide div, we could add a combo class of slider2 instead of slider1. And now all our slider2 settings will be applied to these items. Now we can easily set this to show 5 on desktop, increase the gap, and even set our overflow back to hidden. And when we come back to the live site, this one shows 3. This one shows 5, and there's more space between them. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss another video. If you'd like to check out the clonable for this project, the link is in the description. To see how to push the functionality of Splide Slider even further, check out this tutorial on my Patreon page. I'll catch you in the next video. Goodbye.